that concludes the prepared section of tonight's remarks, and here's where it gets interesting. Now we're going to turn to a Q&A section. Before we even start with the first question that's been prepared, I just want to say one thing, and that is that every person on this panel can historically lay claim to some form of persecution on the basis of what they believe. We stand in an institution of tertiary education, a place that respects pluralism and at which all of these people can sit at one panel without any fear of themselves or for what they believe. That is a privilege, and it is one that deserves to be treated as such. With that in mind, I'd ask that all questioners treat panelists and other questioners with respect, that questions are kept topical and polite and respectful of the other points of view that surround questioners and panelists here tonight. There are 5 pre-prepared questions that I know of and whose askers I know their positions in the audience, and I will roll through them until we run out. After that, the process passes on to you. You can have any kind of question that you want. There are a couple of rules surrounding how you may ask that question. The first rule is that no question may exceed 60 seconds, and if it does, I will find some kind of Oscars-related music to play until you stop speaking. The second is that every question will be answered by a range of panelists, so please don't direct it to one particular panelist at the exclusion of all others. By all means have a question for one panelist based on what you just heard, but be prepared to expect multiple answers. Third rule is that you may ask a follow-up question, but that follow-up question may only be 30 seconds in duration. And the final rule is that every questioner has to stand up. Otherwise, it isn't fun and we can't see you and we might not be able to hear you. So to open up prepared questions, I know that we have one from Domino Wilson. Domino, would you mind standing?
In a world where humanity influences climate change, genetics, appearance, life and death, how can the God of monotheistic religions be considered the God of the world? Aren't we just shaping up to be gods of our own existence?
Sorry, Domino, would you mind repeating that? Sorry, it's just the whole thing open.
In a world where humanity influences its own weather patterns like climate change, genetics, appearance, life and death, how can the God of monotheistic religions be considered the God of the world? Aren't we just shaping up to be gods of our own existence?
So as I understand, that's a question about whether we're playing God.
Yeah.
All right, I might pass that on to.
We're becoming gods, particularly in Western civilization. We turn away from issues such as death. We turn away from issues of deep connection to the biosphere to an extent, and atheists are attempting to address that with movements that deal with death and passing and loss, which is interesting to see. But at the same time, there is an ability that we have to move ourselves into a new imagined world, not simply because there is a God dragging us teleologically in one direction or another, but because within our own diversity, whether we believe or not, there is an incredible creativity there that bubbles up nevertheless, and it doesn't have to be, it seems mysterious at times, but it doesn't have to be mysterious. And also we're very good at maintaining a vast amount of knowledge on the world and keeping to it, whether we believe in a God or not. And that's proved by the fact that some of the very beautiful scripture that Rabbi Cannons reads out on the Sabbath is borrowed from Babylon and is borrowed from civilizations that go way back. And you know, there are atheist Jews in the world who live as Jews but don't necessarily believe that there's a deity in the sky. And these manifestations of knowledge will help us move and face these problems. We don't necessarily need a mystical religious inspiration to go in that direction, and we can be gods now. Yeah.
I want to leap in the sense that I do, it's a wonderful openness to human nature, one which within the Christian worldview is one which is given and created, that is, the creation is given in an unfinished, open, dynamic, exciting, explorative sense, and humans are called to live out that creative nature of God as his reflections in the world, to be in a sense the representatives of God. That said, I think it's a reflection itself of how far our liberal kind of postmodern anticipation of the nature of God has fallen, that we might consider our incredibly limited capacities in any way godlike. Our abilities to change ourselves, to remodel ourselves in order that we might pleased and be accepted and so on speak of a deeper brokenness rather than a greater wonder and power, and usually reflect a hidden darkness in the nature of our culture. Our control of the world and its weather systems has so far reached disaster. And I take it that a Christian would say that we are in fact distorting that image of God in our apparent godliness by clearly not being like God at all in our ability to muck up what has been given. And so I think I want to inject into that a caution, a limitation in both our diminishing of what we understand God to be. The Christian worldview speaks of God far greater than any of our feeble powers, and also a caution about how we elevate ourselves and the sadness and the tragedy always found within our actions.
There's no doubt that humility for the human is a very important part, but on the other hand, as being part of the ultimate creation in the sense that there is a unity of being, and my understanding that the being is in creating through consciousness and awareness. So just to clarify a point that Abdullah picked up earlier, I'm not saying that humans don't have the ability to draw down on the power of cosmic consciousness, rather that anything that we write as being ultimate truth has to be looked at with a lot of skepticism because it's not scientific, evidentiary-based truth. It's whether it, in a sense, works to support the ultimate being. So, as Jews, the first thing that we focus on in terms of our morning reflections is growing in knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. How we use that knowledge, wisdom, and understanding has to be in support of the unity of being. So we are part of this environment. We have to have ultimate consciousness about our place in the environment and how we impact on it. We are animals. We have to take full responsibility for our use of animals if we choose to do so. And I would, not a question, but I would advocate that we if we do use animals, it would not be in the way that we do so in the 21st century. And these would be things that I would actually learn from my understanding of God consciousness. So I would say actually we grow in God consciousness, and this is a good thing, but we have to always remember that it's part of the unity of being, and therefore if we're doing it in harmful, destructive ways to any other part of the being that we share, then we're actually not acting like God, we're acting in a destructive mode, if that makes some sense.
I'm going to move us swiftly so that we only have one response from this left-hand side of the panel. Travis, are we playing God?
I think it's interesting. I mean, the idea of God being dead is obviously one that stems from Nietzsche, as has been mentioned umpteen times already today. And there's obviously the favorite citation, God is dead, but Nietzsche goes on to say, in less cited terms, he says, God is dead, and we have killed him. Does this mean we are gods ourselves? Should this mean that we should want to be gods ourselves? And I think that's an interesting thing. I think when the question is phrased that way, the idea that humanity is moving towards this idea of godness or being God, I think not only does it demonstrate, I guess, a misunderstanding of what humanity and what humanism and what the idea of being human is, but I think it also demonstrates a kind of a misconception of what God can and can't be in the 21st century. I think if you're going to retain God-like as this idea of all the things that we traditionally associate with God, whether or not we believe in him, or the idea of what a God should have, then certainly, I mean, on a simply semantic basis, we're well behind. But I think not to be too aloof, but I don't think it's the question that we need to be asking. Mainly because if this is the society we're living in, if this is the society where we are attempting to control as much as we can and attempting to shape a better world for ourselves because we believe that we're all that we have, then God is the last place I think we need to be looking for inspiration, because in that kind of world, in that kind of context, God is not what we need, and God can't be what we need. Because in that context, God is rescinded or kind of pushed into the philosophical gaps and the syllogisms, and it doesn't exist in an empirical sense, and he doesn't need to exist in an empirical sense for us to kind of move on as a society. So that's, I guess, what I would have to say about that.
All right, our second question, as I understand it, comes from Anne-Marie McLaren. Would you read this out? Anne, do you mind standing?
Hi, thank you all for coming tonight. Viktor E. Frankl, in his book Man's Search for Meaning, brings to light the fact that the psychologist's couch is overtaking the role of religious ministers in man's quest for a fulfilled, healthy frame of mind. With the rising levels of secularism, we seem to only be getting unhappier, with alarming rates of depression and anxiety in affluent countries. What place does the panel believe God, or spirituality and religion more generally, have in the mental health of a nation?
Rabbi, you spent a lot of time in the army and schools, where I imagine you've encountered mental health somewhat. Is godlessness making us sad?
I think, again, it comes down to definitional things. I think it's the lack of feeling connected that leads to the sense of atomization, isolation. These are the things that tend to make people sad and depressed, lonely. And I think what religion or God or spirituality is all based on is that we are all part of a grander being, and we're all part, therefore, of humanity, and we are all, therefore, as well, parts of communities. And so that's where it has its very, very important role to play. But what's been sad is that it's been, in my mind, broken down because religion claimed to be more than it really was. And it claimed that God acted in ways in which I don't think God truly does on a day-to-day level. And so people have therefore ended up, more or less throwing the baby away with the bathwater. And I hope in this 21st century, what we'll be able to do is, it's not about whether you believe, as I said, that God does this or does that or is this, or it's how you relate to the absolute place of, being all part of a system, all part of a collective, but it's more than a materialist thing, and I think that's the other important issue, that it's not about acquisition or consumption, it's about shared being, and that's why I think religion and God and spirituality do have a very important place in health on that level.
Jason, you mentioned a lot in your remarks the relationship between God and good. Do you think that that's something that we're neglecting in the 21st century?
Yes, I do, but, I make the point again. I think that the vast majority of moral questions, while I believe God is necessary to provide a framework, the vast majority of moral questions can be referenced without direct reference to God. But I guess taking up with the rabbi's point, and I'm speaking here as both as a religious believer and as a long-term mental health patient. Psychiatry is scientific psychiatry is, I think, a wonderful thing that can do an awful lot to help people live in accordance with what they themselves value. But that's, I guess, the thing, is I've spoken to a large number of counsellors in my time, and for them it's always a case of helping the patient live in accordance with their own values. But of course, science can't set the values. And that's where, I think, I guess reinforcing what the rabbi said there,
Abdullah, you're a student of medicine at the University of New South Wales. Do you buy that correlation equals causation between godlessness and depression?
Yeah, well, there's more pirates now than there were 100 years ago. The temperature of the planet's been increasing as well with the amount of pirates, so perhaps there's a relationship there. I'm being a little bit facetious. I actually do think that there is a correlation, and I think that there's good evidence, good independent psychological evidence that a lack of meaning creates some pretty ordinary human behaviours and feelings that we certainly don't want everyone to be experiencing. One of the key studies that comes to mind after I was at the Festival for Strange Ideas is that there was a study done by Baumeister and others in 2009 that illustrated that when you present subjects with evidence that there's no such thing as free will, they are far more inclined to be aggressive, selfish and helpless, or not give others help. And, this is just a fact. So, for those out there that say, well, can you be good without God? And I say, well, look, there's scientific evidence that at least says that it's a bit of a question. As for people with mental illness, yeah, we are seeing a sharp rise. Now that could be to do with the fact that we've got a pretty good universal healthcare system now, and mental health isn't as much of a stigmatised thing as it used to be. I mean, you can imagine someone at a panel at Sydney University saying even 20 years ago that they have a long-term mental illness. You know, I mean, that would be really bizarre even at a place like this, let alone out in Broadway. And Broadway's pretty cool. So yeah, but do I think that there's a relationship between loss of meaning and this stuff? Absolutely. And that's why, funnily enough, my religion, Roman Catholics, and certainly Jews that I've spoken to as well, it's very clear that within these religious traditions, despairing of the mercy of God and God's providence is a major sin. Why? Because it leads to, you know, these horrible behaviours. So yeah, hopefully that's something that we can reflect upon, and at least if people want to be new atheists, well, maybe they'll go down the Alain de Botton line and, you know, search for meaning in the meaningless. Otherwise, I think, yeah, we are in a bit of trouble.
Dr. Hartley, one of the things that seems to be being conflated here is the loss of God and the loss of meaning. You mentioned in your remarks that you regarded yourself as a bad atheist. Do you think that there's a way that we can, by taking cultural refuge in God, as you discussed, gain the spiritual enrichment of religion without necessarily the theological constraints?
I love Nick Cave. And I don't know if you can really enjoy Nick Cave unless you go for a, you know, bit of bloodthirsty, vengeful God. You know, it really doesn't work. So that's it, yes, culturally accessible. But to completely avoid your question, I want to ask another one. And no, this is me sacrificing my presence in the debate so that the other panellists can answer. Not only Goodly Bear the Cross can do that. But my question is, and this is where I move the debate up to a bit hysterical register, have you guys read history? The reason we have the Western world in the way that we have it today, and acquisitiveness and ecological vandalism, is down to the Protestant work ethic. It is a really simple and bleedingly obvious manifestation of history. Modernism as we have it today, in its bad aspects, tends to come from the sort of disconnected community manifestations that came with trusting in the authority of the Bible as an individual, which gave rise to, firstly, acquisitiveness, collecting lots of stuff because that proved that God was on your side, and secondly, a disconnection from community because of rampant individualism that sort of has led into this world today. So it's really nice that the panellists are saying by religion we can solve ecological problems, but come on guys, this is how we ended up with the ecological problems in the first place.